Okay, welcome to episode 13 of the Bioenergetic View. I'm your host, Teresa Piela, joined as always by Jay Feldman and Mike Fave. Today we'll be talking about Dr. Ken Berry's interesting views on fruit and honey while eating a carnivore diet, as well as his claims that fructose causes glycation. We'll also dive into a listener's question discussing whether fat versus sugar metabolism is preferable for ATP production and limiting reactive oxygen species and some of the nuance there. So diving right into around the internet, we can start with this clip.
Humans have always eaten fruits and honey and berries. Every time we found them, we ate them all. But we did it for the same reason that the bears do it, to gain weight for the winter. That's why we eat them. They're sweet. They taste good. The plants want us to eat the fruit and the berries at a certain time. You ate all that stuff for 1 or 2 weeks out of the year. For the rest of the year, you didn't eat anything sweet at all, ever.
All right. I think I've been doing it wrong, guys. I've been eating honey and fruit every day of the year, so I should probably just leave. But curious, Mike, what was your reaction to this?
Oh, there's quite a few things here that are, I think, pretty problematic. A lot of logical fallacies and a lot of, conflationary perspectives. So the first thing is that in different environments, fruit grows different times of the year. So maybe if you live in a really northern environment, you'll have fruit for like 2 weeks of the year. But in other environments, you'll typically have fruit for many months throughout the year. So it really depends on where you are. So just like like in the face in general, I think that is incorrect, that assumption. The next thing is that bears and humans have like very different physiology because bears are hibernating animals and humans are not hibernating animals. So to try to say that humans eat fruit to get fat for the winter, I think is very questionable. And in general, because we don't have a hibernation period like other mammals do, like bears. The other thing is that the bears don't necessarily eat fruit to get fat for the winter per se, or the sugars, the fructose in the fruit doesn't necessarily make the bears fat in and of itself. What makes the bears fat is they have a huge change in hormones, like a variety of hormones and metabolic rate as they go into hibernation. Some of those hormones being leptin, ghrelin, thyroid hormones, glucocorticoids, and then there's also changes in mitochondrial function. And there's an induction in what they call a hyperphagia, or an extreme hunger period for the bears prior to hibernating so that they can gain body fat and then hibernate throughout the winter. So this is more of a metabolic phenomenon, and then the bears do seek out food, including berries in that time frame. But the large increases in body fat is driven by the hormonal changes and the drastically increased intake of food altogether that is done to gain fat for the winter. So we have a very different physiology between humans, to the extent that they are studying bears now to see, well, bears get extremely fat, like have a very high body fat percentage. Going into hibernation, they have really high lipids, they have overt insulin resistance and things like this, and they don't develop metabolic concerns like atherosclerosis and things like this in the hibernation state. So they're trying to see what is different between bears and humans that allow bears to have these things and not develop the same disease processes that humans do. And again, different physiology. So one, fruit can be, depending on where you are, fruit is available for much longer than 2 weeks, not to mention other carbohydrate sources. I know fructose was the major thing here. Two, and I guess another thing to put into place here is that humans that evolved as an equatorial species initially, which would throw shade into this idea that like we would be at these really high latitudes all the time, with the people talking about the evolutionary perspective. Then the next thing is that the bears are hibernating animals, humans are not. And so we have drastic metabolic changes there. And then even with that, the bears are gaining weight not because they're eating fructose in general or berries in general. They're gaining weight because of hormonal changes and changes in amounts of food and appetite and metabolic changes prior to going into hibernation. So it's the argument and is just like a logical fallacy. It's a conflation that doesn't really make much sense when you actually get into the details of it. It sounds nice, I think. We're like, oh yeah, the bears eat the berries and the honey, and that's probably what makes them fat. I remember at one point when we were in low carb, Jay and I were talking about some of this stuff. Like we were in Miami, we'd have conversations about some of these things. But when you actually dig into it just a little bit, There's tons of papers on PubMed talking about this. Even Richard Johnson is a author on one of the papers looking at bear physiology and trying to understand what's going on with bears and metabolic diseases. You see that that's not the reason that they are necessarily gaining weight in that way. It's more of like direct metabolic changes and hormonal changes that happen prior to hibernation.
Yeah, it seems like he's playing on the fear aspect too, fear of fat and using that as a hook to get people to latch on to this idea and, without even breaking it down or like Mike was saying, thinking about, okay, where is there any truth in this? Can we actually make the comparison between humans and bears? Jay, what was your reaction watching this clip? You pulled this one up, didn't you?
Yeah. And as we'll note in both this clip and the next clip, he does a great job of dumbing things down and trying to use analogies and kind of surface level arguments to make these concepts understandable. But again, in the process, there's just clearly incorrect information. So as Mike was pointing out, the difference with bears gaining body fat is not that they are eating the same amount of calories and they just replace some of the fat with carbohydrates, with fructose, and they're gaining all this weight. Instead, as he noted, there's this hyperphagia where they eat massive amounts, and it's not like they're just eating, a few hundred calories extra, they're just eating a little bit of berries. They go from eating 8,000 calories a day on average to eating 15 to 20,000 calories a day. So they're typically more than doubling their food intake, and that the macronutrient ratio shifts a little bit toward a bit more carbohydrate, but it's still, they're eating way more protein, fat, and carbs than they were before, even though the carb, percentage might go up 10 to 15%, and protein is really the one that goes down. They actually keep eating the same amount of fat for the most part because protein isn't as good as a building block for fat mass. But the idea that this is going to happen to us in humans again is, if you go through a hyperphagic state and eat more than twice what you're going to eat, and that includes berries or doesn't include berries, you probably gain some weight. Like, I don't think that part is untrue. But to act as though it's the fructose is ridiculous. And you also have certain species of bears. There's the Asiatic black bear, which eats high carbs all year round. It's eating around 70% of its diet from carbohydrates. And that's the same in summer and autumn. Autumn is normally the time when they're gaining body fat and preparing for winter, but they actually don't have any increase in carbs as a percentage of macronutrients. Again, more than anything, it's the fact that they're eating insane amounts of food and going to great lengths to do so. So to blame that on fructose, I think, is totally missing the point. And then it's funny to look at bears, which have such different physiology and such different existences than us, when you have animals that are way closer to us, our closest living relatives that you can look at, and they also eat a ton of fructose. But guess what? They don't gain lots of body fat. So we can look at chimpanzees, for example, that are eating 60 to 100% of their diet from fruit, obviously very high fructose diets, and their body fat percentage, not only is it low, it's like way lower than ours. If you look at bonobos, the male body fat percentage is less than 0.5%. It's like 0.005% or something ridiculous, despite eating massive amounts of fruit. For women, it's like 3% body fat, or female bonobos. Their body fat percentage is 3%, which is lower than bodybuilding humans, like lower than the lowest that you can go and be alive, basically. And yet they're eating massive amounts of fruit. So obviously we're intentionally skipping over those kinds of animals because they don't support our point, and we're just picking some random animal out, or not a random one, but one that seems like it'll support our point, even though it's totally irrelevant here. And then again, the last point to highlight is, yeah, we've been equatorial for the vast majority of our evolution, millions and millions and millions of years, through the different hominids. We've been in equatorial regions. Even as humans, the estimates are that 300,000 years ago, give or take, is when humans came about. We were staying in small regions in Africa until maybe 50 to 70,000 years ago. And even after that, we still stayed in generally equatorial tropical regions until about 30,000 years ago. So for all this time, if you want to invoke the evolutionary idea that we only would have eaten fructose in the context of gaining weight, and it only would have been a couple weeks of the year, which I think we've talked about this before, is an inherently weak argument to begin with. Even if that was the case, it doesn't mean that fruit is unhealthy. It doesn't mean that eating fructose is a problem, even if we didn't do it historically. But the evidence doesn't suggest that anyway. It does suggest, looking at a number of different lines of evidence, that we have been eating high carb diets for a long period of time, and we've been existing in regions that contained carbohydrates year round, including fruit. And again, the other thing people always point to is they say, the apple or mango you eat now has way more sugar than before. And that's true. But there's also ancient wild fruits that are really dense in carbohydrates. It just isn't apples. It's weird fruits that you've never heard of, but that were available and would have provided large sources of sugar all year round. Obviously different fruits in different times of year. There's a really great article by Denise Minger talking about that, if anyone's interested. But yeah, I think we're just kind of creating a story, kind of like we will be in the next clip as well, to try to support a point, but it's not actually based in reality.
Yeah, I found it interesting that he mentioned how we eat them because they're sweet and they taste good, as if something's pleasurable, we should be questioning that and trying to use our willpower to not listen to our body. I think it's just an interesting frame, and it's no wonder so many people are confused if our impulses and those natural drives are called into question, and we should be fighting them, basically.
Yeah, well, you have to have that masochistic sort of perspective, which all of us have, right? We've all been there. We've all done versions of low carb and carnivore and keto, but you have to have that perspective while you're putting yourself through that and using the willpower to, stay away from the foods that taste good, because it's not pleasant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the body starts to riot.
I think it's also interesting to look at and say, like, we don't even have to go to other animal species to see that a high carb diet isn't pushing obesity and things like this. And that there's access to carbs year round. So we can look at other species which have been looked at that have access to higher carbohydrate intakes throughout the year, more than 2 weeks, including groups like the Hadza, and then you have other hunter-gatherer groups that still exist. They're on high carb intakes and they are not getting fat and hibernating for the winter, and they do live in areas where there isn't really necessarily a winter. So I think you have evidence in existing human groups on what would be typically considered their normal diet. You have evidence in like our closest genetic relatives as far as animals go. And then if you think about human evolution in general, the vast majority of our evolutionary period would arguably not have been in cold environments where we have fruit available for only 2 weeks out of the year. So it's like on multiple lines of evidence, it's like this is like, again, like as Jay pointed out, like kind of cherry picking a particular model and then conflating it with our circumstance when it doesn't even make sense. And the reason I point out some of the evolutionary stuff is because we keep seeing that pop up in the comments. I don't want to open the can of worms, but it's just like, we've only, for millions and millions of years, we didn't eat any carbohydrate. And it's like, I'm not really so sure about that. If you actually go through and look at the evidence and then, conflating some of these other animal models, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, similarly, just the primal approach being framed as better, we aren't living the way we used to. So to confuse it with maybe an unfounded frame and then saying that we should be going back to how our ancestors ate and the foods that they had access to and the foods that they chose, it doesn't really apply to our modern environment. In fact, we could argue that so many of the assaults in our environment require us to be more skillful and more adaptive and really use our tools with intention instead of just doing what is primal or living in a more like scarcity based way, like Ken Berry was talking about, how if we didn't have access to these things.
Yeah. And the idea that just because we had periods of scarcity doesn't mean that was supportive of our health, right? And we'll just maybe just touch on this real briefly, but I think everybody in that camp recognizes that we had the agricultural revolution and that shrunk our brain size, right? And that led to negative effects. And so we can recognize that just because something happened in our history doesn't mean it was a positive thing, just because we adapted towards something. And so, but then to assume that we had periods of famine or we had periods without carbohydrates, so that must have been a good thing. There's a huge assumption built in there. We don't know if that was something that maybe was holding us down, maybe kept our brain size lower in a way that, we have, obviously we're only guessing because we don't have that much data on the history. There's important data to look at, and maybe there'll be something for another episode. But yeah, and the evolution argument, as you said, Mike, keeps coming up, and we'll keep discussing it. When it comes to creating a diet for optimal health, there's a lot of conflicting information out there, And that's why I've created the Energy Balance Food Guide to help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The Energy Balance Food Guide is a one-page infographic that organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it also has a separate spectrum that adjusts the scale for you in the case that you're dealing with various digestive symptoms. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.
Yeah. Mike, any more notes to add before we watch his other clip?
No, I don't. There's it's a whole can of worms to get into all the evolutionary stuff. And I keep seeing it in my comments, and I keep seeing it on the comments on Jay's and I's videos here. And the claims that are made are kind of somewhat absurd. And I don't mean that in an offensive way, but they're just blatantly absurd, kind of this conflation of our metabolism with bear metabolism. And they're easily just with a cursory search and looking at the evolutionary pathways that we know so far, even if you were to use the line of evidence of evolution and what was happening in the past, it still doesn't support that perspective. So it's just a weird line of argumentation that we see. We're going to hone in on this really narrow time frame in our evolutionary development and say see, look, this was the best time for X, Y, and Z reason. And so it's a little bit myopic, I think, especially when you start expanding out timelines. And then you also consider current context and then the other evidence that we have. So, and I think relying on just that piece is also pretty weak. I think you'd want to have multiple pieces, multiple elements that you're looking at to try to gauge and figure out what we're doing with diet and how we're managing health instead of just this evolutionary perspective, because I think it could give you a very limited lens and then it alters your decisions in weird ways, which justifies some of that's what some of these proponents are using to justify diets like the carnivore diet, right? And then even the hybridization of fruit stuff is also an interesting line, as if we don't actually breed animals in a particular way, change milk yields on cows or change the amount of meat that you get from particular types of animals as well. It's the whole entire perspective. It's very myopic, and there is some truth to some of it, but the larger context of it, when you start to actually look at it overall, it doesn't really make much sense.
This clip fits really well with our theme today. Just the short clips that go viral or are so popular on the internet that are confusing and might require some breaking down. So let's watch this one.
Fructose is 10 times more glycating than glucose. It gums up, it mucks up, it stops up. Just imagine, remember when you were a kid and you would eat candy and you get the candy? Remember how you'd be all sticky? Remember that? I used to hate that. That's glycation in your cells, in your tissues, in your capillaries. That's glycation. Stuff doesn't work right when it's all gummed up. Fructose gums up your cells and tissues 10 times more than glucose. Fruit juice is over half the sugar is fructose. But none of the tests your doctor can order can detect that glycation. Think about that. Think about the implications of that. So the next time somebody tells you, oh, fruit's natural, eat all the fruit you want, they don't know what they're talking about. Next time somebody says, oh, honey is full of magical nutrients, it's full of fructose. That's what it's full
of. Jay, do you remember when you were all sticky?
Oh, man.
Back in the day. Well, okay, he's entertaining, but as you were watching this, there's several points to break down, and I think we could start with just talking about what is glycation. Is it something we should be concerned about? And talking about how it's actually formed in the body.
So I do think that's probably a good place to start. Glycation is essentially an interaction between carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, some interaction between them that is essentially causing damage and then can lead to damage to DNA and structure of our cells and things like that. And unfortunately, the name glycation implies that this is a carbohydrate-driven process. And I think most people, not only on the surface, but most people who are talking about it especially in the low-carb sphere, point to it as such. They bring on this notion that it's carbohydrate driven, right? It's glucose or fructose are causing glycation. And there's truth there is some truth to that, which is that they can. They actually do so extremely slowly. It's a very slow process in order to create glycation products from the interaction of glucose or fructose and proteins. But they're certainly not the only agents of glycation. And there's a number of others to consider. Lipid peroxides are really the primary ones that we would want to be concerned about, and they're far more glycating. Like the polyunsaturated fats especially are going to glycate to a much greater extent than any carbohydrates would. And that would be, those are generally going to be most responsible here, is basically this interaction between the lipids and proteins. But I think there's a number of reasons why it's pointed to. For one, we measure glycation of hemoglobin in the blood, which is hemoglobin A1C. And because this interaction or this process from glucose is non-enzymatic, it's just something that happens with time, looking at hemoglobin A1C can be an okay measure of your average blood sugar over time, because you're looking at this interaction between glucose and hemoglobin. But this kind of brings on the idea that most glycation is that, like, it's happening in the blood, and it's this interaction between sugar in the blood and other components of either the blood or like the blood vessels. But the reality is that most glycation actually occurs inside our tissues. It's not actually as related to what's going on in the bloodstream so much. And there's a number of different agents that cause glycation. You do have the sugars, but and the polyunsaturated fats, as I mentioned, but you also have these various intermediates, which are called dicarbonyls, which are many, many times more glycating than any carbohydrate by far. So as an example, where a number of different dicarbonyls are as much as 20,000 times more reactive than glucose in terms of their ability to cause glycation. So, we're talking about very different levels here. Yes, it's actually true. There are in vitro studies showing that fructose is almost or nearly 10 times as glycating as glucose. But even so, we're talking about a process that's still occurring very, very slowly and is a very, very minor contributor to glycation compared to other compounds that we want to be concerned about that, again, are 20,000 times as reactive as glucose in terms of forming glycation. And again, just kind of circling back into the big picture, many people are familiar, well, maybe some people are familiar with what are called AGEs, advanced glycation end products, and these are basically associated with things like DNA damage and tissue damage and protein damage. And so it is something to be aware of, but the idea that these are driven by carbohydrate is really a very small piece of the picture. We're not looking at the rest of it, which I would say is far more relevant. So a couple other things to mention. Even if we're just looking at the bloodstream and we're considering that there's like 7 to 10 times as much glycation going on from fructose than glucose, the amount of fructose in the bloodstream is extremely small, more than 100 times less than glucose at rest. And so even if you are concerned about glycation from glucose and fructose, the amount of fructose is so small that it's still not going to be very concerning there. And even after extremely large doses of fructose consumption, there are studies where they do as much as 75 grams of fructose consumption at once, which is a lot. That would be the equivalent of maybe like 4 sodas, give or take, 3 or 4. And even then, the peak of fructose levels in the blood was 7 milligrams per deciliter. And as a, like, kind of on average, or like a healthy blood glucose, let's say, is like 85 or so. So you're talking about still, after a huge fructose load, levels that are 10 times less in the blood than glucose. So even if you're concerned about fructose glycation of being 10 times as great, the reality is the levels in the blood are going to be so much lower that it's not any more concerning, so to speak, than glucose would. And the other point that I think is so important to mention here, and to be honest, I think it's one of the most pervasive ideas and like areas of ignorance in the low carb space. And this coming from someone who was in that space and thought the same thing, but is this idea that people who are not low carb don't understand that there are potential problems with hyperglycemia or hyperinsulinemia, and that diabetes involves those things, and that's going to lead to higher A1C. It's almost like there's this disconnect, that this assumption that people don't recognize that. But the reality is that what we're actually saying is you can consume carbs and still have low blood sugar, still have low A1C values, not like pathologically low blood sugar, like healthy blood sugar levels. And that's what we're encouraging. We're not encouraging this idea that we just want to have massive blood sugar spikes all the time and keep our blood sugar up, at 200 milligrams per deciliter by constantly having carbohydrates. The reality is actually having the carbohydrates helps with insulin sensitivity and helps to keep your blood sugar lower on a consistent basis. So that's one thing to mention. And I guess the last thing I'll mention here, there's a lot more to dig into, but I'll let you go ahead, Mike, is that if we're concerned about glycation happening more in the tissues, which is more of where it happens as opposed to the bloodstream, the consumption of fructose is really not a concern there because fructose does not tend to stay as fructose inside the tissues. Most fructose is taken up by the liver, and then over 90% of it in most cases is converted to glucose, glycogen, or lactate, and then sent out to the rest of the tissues. So even if you were concerned about the in vitro glycating effects of fructose in tissues, that's really not going to be a concern because fructose doesn't stay as fructose. It gets converted to other things, or it starts to be used to produce energy. So when you're consuming fruit, there's not all this fructose sitting in your blood. There's not all this fructose sitting in your tissues, just damaging and gumming things up. It's a nice story, again. It's a nice idea that you eat a lollipop and then you have the sticky mess just left inside your tissues. But the reality is that that's not at all the case.
Mike, jump on in. What was your reaction to this?
I mean, I think there's a fundamental, I think this is like a little factoid that we get, which is true, right? So fructose is 10 times more glycating than glucose. On its face statement, like that's 100% true. We see that in the research. But it's like in the context of the body, does this even matter? I think Jay pointed out, and this doesn't really matter. There's studies looking at fasting glucose or fasting fructose levels, even in diabetics. And what we're looking at is 0.21 milligrams per deciliter. And to put that in context, so you have 0.21 milligrams per deciliter of fructose. A typical fasting glucose level is going to be like, ideally you want in the 70s to 80 milligrams per deciliter, 70s and 80s. So many times more amounts of glucose. So even to sit here and argue that fructose is more glycating than glucose is absolutely irrelevant. Like it doesn't matter, especially in the context of dietary intake, and especially in the context of metabolism of fructose, right? So that's the first thing. The next thing is that the driver of carbohydrate-based glycation is typically due to metabolic dysfunction. So what winds up happening is you have hyperglycemia, you have issues in glucose metabolism. The carbohydrate glucose gets fed into glycolysis. And when there's problems in glycolysis or there's problems with utilization of glucose at the cell in general, what you wind up seeing is a shunting of glucose towards the polyol pathway with production of sorbitol and subsequent production of fructose. And then you get at the tissue level, because of the metabolic dysfunction, the changes in glycation. You get increased glycation end products, glyoxylate and methylglyoxal. So the problem is not necessarily carbohydrate intake. The problem, and that you see this in diabetics, even if they have high fasting glucose levels and they don't have carbohydrate intake, it's the metabolic dysfunction predisposes a shift towards glycation, not necessarily the carbohydrate intake driving the glycation acutely in each circumstance. So I think this is the fundamental thing to pay attention to. And another thing to point out is some of the best tests we have to measure glycation are fructosamine and hemoglobin A1C. And one of the primary proponents of a low carbohydrate diet, like a ketogenic carnivore diet, is Dr. Sean Baker, and his measure of glycation via his hemoglobin A1C is in the 6s. So he's not eating any carbs, yet he is heavily glycating his hemoglobin, and that's a non-enzymatic reaction. And that again is because of changes in glucose metabolism at the cell, whether he's eating the carbs or not. So I think the fundamental problem that we're looking at is really what's going on with the glucose metabolism, not are you having carbohydrates or not, and then that's just driving glycation, because that's clearly not the case. You can look at studies where people improve their hemoglobin A1Cs even with carbohydrates present inside the diet. So I think those are the first two important points for me, is that how much one thing glycates the other is kind of like how much more fructose is glycating than glucose is irrelevant, because in the body you're never going to have high blood levels of fructose, and you will only see higher tissue levels of fructose with metabolic dysfunction because the carbohydrates not being used appropriately. The second piece being that the alterations in carbohydrate metabolism is what drives that glycation process. the last piece I want to mention, this tails into what Jay was saying, is on low carbohydrate diets, you actually see increased end products of increased glycating products like methylglyoxal because of the change in metabolism and the shift towards some of the fatty acid oxidation and ketone production. So even in states where you don't have carbohydrates, even if you're on this ketogenic diet to protect yourself from glycation, you are producing products that drive glycation like methylglyoxal. And this is directly shown in humans. So I think the fundamental piece to understand is what is going on metabolically. That is the central driver, and less so like, oh, I ate some carbs and I glycate. And the one piece I want to back up to here is that I don't think it's borne out in the research that eating carbohydrates drives that metabolic dysfunction. And we see this in studies where people actually improve their blood glucose tolerance, and decrease hemoglobin A1C levels, even with high carbohydrate intake, right? So it's not just eating carbs drives this process. I even had a comment under my video recently, somebody saying, like I made a video about how I have like a high sugar diet, and they say, you're going to glycate, you're going to have all this glycation. It's like my last hemoglobin A1C value after almost a decade on a high carbohydrate diet was like, I think it was like 5.2 or something like this. So well within the normal and optimal range, indicating that I am not having non-enzymatic glycation happening despite the carbohydrate intake. And again, this is because I am effectively utilizing the carbohydrates and not having the metabolic dysfunction that's driving that glycation process. So I think that's the more important piece to focus on than to like talk about, well, fructose is more glycating than glucose. It's like it almost doesn't, it really just doesn't matter here. And then like all the other pieces that come after that, it's like nice visuals and it's a great story, but it's like it's fiction. It's a fictional story. It's a conflation. It's association of conflation to give this image where that's not actually what's happening overall.
Yeah, I think it can be pretty convincing too, just to hear someone say it so confidently. And like you mentioned, the images, you're kind of locked in, and all of these videos have that in common. Not to throw Ken Berry under the bus, but a lot of these wellness doctor influencers are doing the same thing. They'll say something, maybe it's framed completely incorrectly. They've got the candy, the sugars, the fruit. So we're just kind of mesmerized. Well, maybe we're not mesmerized, but most people might be mesmerized and forget to ask other questions. And Jay, I'm wondering, you briefly brought this up, how PUFA might be more of a problem in terms of causing these glycation end products. If someone actually is dealing with pretty serious glycation, would your thought be to do a higher carb, lower fat diet? What would be your approach?
Yeah, and it's not just PUFA, it's ketones as well, which I want to touch on here in a minute, because so a couple of things to just go back through. There's just so much incorrect with this take. As Mike was saying, it's really common to see high blood glucose levels and high A1C values on people who are on carnivore or low carb diets, especially, and they tend to go down when you then see those people bring carbohydrates back in. We saw it with Paul Saladino as well. I think his went from 5.7 to 5.3 a pretty short time after bringing carbohydrates in. So even if we were blaming carbohydrates, even if we were blaming glucose in the blood as the problem, there's no absence of that on a low carb diet. We know that we produce it through gluconeogenesis, and if anything, it tends to be higher on these low carb diets for people who are not severely insulin resistant. But of course, for people who are, then we want to work on bringing that A1C down, but we could do that by including carbohydrates in the diet. So that's one thing that I wanted to touch on. But the other thing, it is worth noting that omega-6s will produce AGEs more than 20 times as quickly as glucose. But as I mentioned, the dicarbonyls, which are considered intermediate glycation products, are 20,000 times more reactive than glucose. And so we want to be really careful with these. Well, we know that one of the main dicarbonyls is called methylglyoxal. And one of the primary precursors to methylglyoxal is a ketone called acetone. And so when you're on a ketogenic diet, you'll see dramatic increases in ketone production, dramatic increases in acetone. And people always point to the idea that, yes, you'll have gluconeogenesis, but there's nothing negative about that. Well, one of the many negatives is that in order to convert acetone to glucose through gluconeogenesis, which is done with about 2/3 of the acetone in the blood, 2/3 of it is going to be converted to glucose, you have to produce methylglyoxal in that process. It's one of the integral steps in order to convert that acetone to glucose through gluconeogenesis. So we then have studies that look at low carb and ketogenic diets and show massive increases, over twofold increases in methylglyoxal levels on these diets compared to people who are not. And the deeper into ketosis you go, the higher the methylglyoxal levels are. And then when you then look at other studies, there's studies on children who are on ketogenic diets, and they see increased levels of lipid peroxidation. Again, presumably due to the actual glycating concerns of these low carb diets. So as easy as it is to weave this story of glycation, of like carbohydrates equal glycation equals damage, we don't actually see that play out. And instead, not only does a high carb diet lower A1C, but we also see that high fructose diets tend to lower hemoglobin A1C as well. Even in people with type 2 diabetes, you still see that providing pretty significant amounts of fructose will lower A1C. There are some studies on rodents that provide fructose, so to speak, and increase age formation, but they fall to the same problems with all of the other research in rodents on fructose, or the vast majority of it, which is that you have insane amounts of fructose feeding. They'll put them on like 60% fructose diets, which is nearly impossible to get. I mean, if you're, in any natural source of fruit juice, sugar, you're getting about 50-50 fructose and glucose. So you couldn't even have a 60% fructose diet. Even if you only ate plain table sugar, you would still have only a 50% fructose diet. So to have these sorts of diets is ridiculous. We don't absorb it well, as Mike was saying, and leads to endotoxin production, which is then actually going to be responsible for a lot of those issues. They have other studies where they do like fructose infusions and find ages, but in terms of actual real diets, that's not actually going to be the result. So circling back to your question, if someone was concerned about ages, lipid peroxidation, oxidative stress, or general health, I think bringing in carbohydrates is essential to that sort of state. And as far as, I think you were asking, Teresa, about whether to keep the fat low, and I think that would just depend on someone's insulin sensitivity. If someone's struggling on the insulin sensitivity side, it can certainly help to bring that fat down, but it's not necessary. It kind of depends on the individual.
Unless they were consuming a bunch of polyunsaturated fat or like processed chips and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if that was, I would highly recommend against that.
Well, I have heard family members actually mention and ask me about their A1C test, and following up with how they're trying to eat less sugar and eat less baked goods. And I think it's really important to discuss the nuance of this for people that are really trying to improve their health. And, they get this test from their doctor and they're really concerned about developing diabetes, or they're pre-diabetic, and then they take out maybe what could be the most helpful fruits and all the polyphenols and anti-inflammatory compounds that might actually help restore some of their glucose metabolism.
Yeah, I think that just tagging into that, Teresa, I think it's really important to understand what exactly is going on with hemoglobin A1C in the blood, like overall. So you have, if you think about the blood, it's basically a pipeline that, when we talk about like fuel sources, between the liver and between the cells, right? So if somebody is not utilizing their fuel effectively at the cellular level, you can get a backup of whatever that fuel source is, both carbs and fats, in the blood. That's where you see the lipid panel change. It's why you see changes in blood glucose values. It's why you see changes in hemoglobin A1C. And so, again, this boils down to the fundamental problem of whatever is going on at the cell, it needs to be fixed so that the oxidation of both fats and of carbohydrates is working effectively. And I think people typically see, if they're having metabolic dysfunction in general, A1C go down and blood glucose levels go down when they don't have carbohydrate in general. And that's because if you're not taking up that fuel source at the cellular level, then you just leave more of that in the bloodstream. And then basically the more carbohydrate you have in the bloodstream overall, the more likely you are to have this non-enzymatic glycation process where the glucose interacts with some of the amino acids in hemoglobin and creates hemoglobin A1C. But that doesn't mean that lowering the carbohydrates fixes the problem at the cell. It just means now you have less overall amount of carbohydrate floating around in the pipes, so you get less glycation, but the fundamental problem of metabolism still hasn't been addressed. And that's why when you take people who go on low carbohydrate diets, like even in the ketogenic diet studies, or there's like a meta-analysis on keto diets, what you see is hemoglobin A1C and blood glucose values go back, like drop within the first 6 months. But then at the 12-month mark, they don't actually find a significant difference in those values because, again, what winds up happening is initially you don't have the carbohydrates, the values start to drop. And then over time, and I see this with a lot of people that I've worked with, and you also see this with people in the carnivore diet, including prominent influencers like Dr. Sean Baker, you start to see that blood glucose starts to creep up again through gluconeogenesis, and then glucose tolerance is even worse down the line because now you're primarily using fatty acids. So again, the problem is one, we are looking at abstract values to gauge what's going on in the body. Hemoglobin A1C is giving us a rough idea of average blood glucose values. And that gives if you understand that in the context of, I have this pipeline with fuel moving through it, and the problem is either something going on with production at the liver or something going on with uptake at the cell. And then it's like, I need to fix these problems, but a lot of people are focusing on just what's going on in the pipeline. And that's why you get these interpretations of, I just want to lower carbohydrate intake. Okay, and then my A1C goes down and then I'm good. And it's like, no, you want to fix what's going on at the cellular level. You want to see, okay, is there micronutrient problems going on? Is there dysbiosis, endotoxemia going on? Is there long-term chronic stress and the stress hormones are impacting things? Is there things going on with excessive amounts of body fat present? And then the body fat is actually leaking free fatty acids, inflammatory mediators, and that's affecting what's going on at the cellular level. These are the things that we want to start to address because ideally, a healthy individual should be able to oxidize both carbohydrate and fatty acids, at normally. There shouldn't be any problems at all with using either fuel source. So just removing one fuel source doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it does make lab values look better, at least for a period of time. But the ideal, solving the problem would be I'm eating carbohydrates and I'm actually seeing a lower A1C value and my glucose curve is much better overall. My oral glucose tolerance test is much better overall and my insulin levels are ideal. That's where it's like, okay, these are ideal targets. And then in that circumstances, you would have less advanced glycation end products because you're not going to shift metabolism or the glucose towards the polyol pathway, which will then drive some of the glycation that we see in the diabetic or the impaired glucose tolerance state. And so again, that's why the metabolism piece is the most important. And when you think about the blood test, at least when I think about the blood test, I think, okay, I have this pipe that's moving fuel back and forth. And the problem is either at the use of that fuel at the cellular level and or something going on at the production level. And they oftentimes go together because when you have insulin resistance, when you have issues metabolically, you start to have the liver itself will start to increase outflow of carbohydrate and fats and things like this to help meet that lack of energy supply at the cellular level. So these are things that, they kind of go hand in hand, but when we want to be careful using an abstract marker to try to gauge these things. So you need to have the context around it, I think, appropriate. And so for your relatives, the recommendation or the thought process of my end would be to try to figure out what is going on overall, what's going on with body composition, what's going on with hormones, what's going on with micronutrients, what's going on with the gut, what's going on endotoxin. Look at this overarching picture and then start to solve those problems so that at the end of the day, weight is stable, hemoglobin A1C is dialed in, blood glucose levels are optimized, hormones look good, and they're eating carbohydrates and also fats. Because it's not necessarily that the whole thing now is you have to choose your fuel source, right? We all have to either do fats or do carbs. And I think the more appropriate frame is that there's going to be some mix of fuels for all of us, including fats and carbs, that's going to be optimal because you're going to need fats and you're going to need carbs and you're going to need protein, not to survive, but for optimal health. Because we're going to get into that eventually. But the idea that these things aren't essential for survival is, again, irrelevant. Nobody here is just trying to get by. Everybody is trying to optimize their health. And so it's figuring out what that mix is going to be with carbs and fats so that you can optimize your blood glucose regulation, your hormones, digestion, etc., and set up the diet appropriately from there. So I think that is that's the perceptual shift, at least for me when I'm thinking about it, instead of just my A1C is this, I need to drop all my carbs. It's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction without the proper context. And I think clips that we see from people like Dr. Ken Berry create this perspective because they're very misleading, and it creates this fear. I'm gonna have sugar and I'm gonna get glycated like that melting candy in the picture, and it's not necessarily. That's not really how it works when you actually dig into the mechanisms. And also, I guess one caveat here is when we're talking about carbohydrates and sugar, I think for all three of us, none of us are sitting here saying like, hey, we should all be plowing Sour Patch Kids and jelly beans and Cokes all day long. We're talking about figuring out which carbohydrate sources work for your system, help you to feel well, that you digest well, keep your stress low, and things like this. So fruits, tubers, maybe use some honey, some maple syrup or sugar with your coffees or whatever the thing is, but prioritize like more nutrient dense carbohydrate sources overall. So I want to put that here as well, because it's like people be like, oh, you're pro sugar, like you're pro high sugar, and it's like, yeah, from like fruits and juices and things like this, and potentially tubers, which is, I think, have vastly different effects on the physiology when you look in the research than just sitting there and spooning granulated sugar or eating some of these candies and stuff like this, which is, again, I point that out because that's the imagery that we get shown for sugar in this video here.
Even the pro metabolic approach, I was talking to a client recently, and he asked, oh yeah, isn't that the Pepsi diet? And it's just interesting to see how it's interpreted. Similarly, like when we get one test back, like the A1, getting that level of the A1C, I've noticed people can kind of hyper focus and trying to think of how can they change and control and manipulate that one data point, as opposed to like what Mike was just saying. Can we look at the bigger picture and see how we can support metabolism in a more sustainable and life-giving way, as opposed to trying to nitpick and micromanage, which I think would drive most people crazy. And maybe people listening can relate to that, where like it's one test result and it feels like if only they can fix that, then their health problems will go away. I see the same thing with like SIBO tests, for example. They think if they can just eradicate the SIBO and do all these protocols, then every other health problem will work itself out. Maybe not. I haven't seen that happen yet. That would be great. But oversimplify and create more stress than we need to when we can just look bigger picture.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And what a disservice to cause that, to create that hyper focus on one individual marker, pathway, or something like that. And then also to create this clear, fear-driven avoidance of certain foods. And as you were saying, it's like so pervasive, right? So you mentioned that about your family members. It just reminded me, I had a client the other day. I mean, this was a little while ago when they mentioned this. I kept encouraging her to eat more carbohydrates. She is really, really scared of it. And she keeps pointing to her blood work and she's like, but my glucose, but my A1C, like they were elevated. I'm trying to get them down. Like, why do you keep telling me to eat carbs? And then we just got a recent test and both came down. And I think, yeah, there's, for most of the audience in the sphere, like in the low carb sphere, which we all were at one point, you're just getting one side of the picture and you don't realize it. There's just this, like, again, you see the images of the candy here, you hear glucose and glycation and A1C and diabetes and obesity and insulin resistance and fatty liver disease, and it all goes together. And the other people are just ignorant of this. They don't even know that relationship exists. And that's why they're all telling you to eat carbs, as opposed to the actual reality, which is that we are aware of those disease processes and we're aware of insulin resistance. It's just that when you actually look at the research and the physiology, carbs don't cause it. That's the big difference here. And I think it's really, clips like this just encourage those misunderstandings. And then even worse here, you have this fear of this invisible boogeyman of you can't test what the fructose is doing to your body. There's no way to know how bad it is. So you have to fear it even more. And there's no counter argument to that because you can't test and show that it's not actually causing a problem. I think one thing that might be, one thought process that, one thing I was thinking about is that if you're eating equal parts glucose and fructose, meaning that you're not having any starch, you're just having, a pure sugar-based diet from fruits and juices and things like that. And knowing that these are non-enzymatic processes, so they're purely a matter of concentration, then you could consider A1C to be a pretty good proxy for any sort of fructose glycation that can't be tested for. If your A1C is really good in that situation with the amount of glucose that's coming in, if you're having equal parts fructose, you would assume that any equivalent markers would also be good, considering that levels in the blood are even lower proportionally than the potential increase in glycating effect. So yeah, but it's again, I think just such a massive disservice to people who are trying to improve their health.
The one thing I want to point out here with that, Jay, is that you actually can gauge what's going on with these different foods, like relatively well, but you just have to use multiple markers, right? So like you can use A1C, you can look at fructosamine and then insulin and then fasting glucose, and you can look at your response to a carbohydrate-based meal. You can look at what's going on with body composition. Like there's a lot of ways that you can gauge, and it's frustrating me because this is like, let's change the argument and like, let's put this implicit belief that we can't test this thing. Like Bart K does this too with like, it's a construct. It's like, come on, man. Like we actually have metrics and we have components that we can look at here to gauge how people are handling this particular fuel source if you actually understand the physiology appropriately. So when you understand the physiology appropriately and you understand the pathways and what's going on, and you look at a person's symptoms and you look at a multitude of values together, you can gauge to some extent how this person is metabolizing these different components. And there also is more in-depth testing. I'm not saying people have to go and do this, but there is more in-depth testing to look at and say like, okay, this person is actually moving carbohydrate into the Krebs cycle appropriately. They're not shunting towards lactate. And then things are flowing through the Krebs cycle in the correct way. People don't even have to go and do this though. How are you feeling? How are you sleeping? How are you feeling after your meals? What's going on with your body composition, with the dietary setup? Do you look at some basic markers in your labs and see how things are shifting? So you can get a gauge on this type of stuff. If you have all of these things moving in the right direction, then you can comfortably say, okay, things at large are going well, and you don't have to have this like one singular test that tells you what your fructose levels are in this particular cell in your body that tells you if it's glycating or not. There's like a variety of metrics you can gauge and use your experience from your symptoms, which is real-time data, plus testing to gauge what's going on. I mean, for me with clients, that's what I'm doing. It's like, okay, your blood glucose is looking better. I'll give you an example. I have a client who I work with he's on insulin. He's insulin-dependent type 2 diabetic. His insulin usage went from 200 units when we started to averaging 60 now. So it's like, you can't sit here and tell me that his insulin sensitivity hasn't improved and I doubled his carbohydrate intake. So it's like, you can't say, and then now we're at a circumstance where even on the 60 units of insulin that he has per day, he's actually getting lows now. So he has to, because the pump is overshooting his values. I just spoke with him last night. So these are components where it's like, that's a way that you can say, okay, my carbohydrate tolerance, my insulin sensitivity, these things are improving. And then A1C value, when we started 8.9, we just got a test back last week, it's at 7. So you're not going to sit here and say the carbohydrates in this individual, well, he's just having this hidden, like unknown glycation going on, or we don't know what's going to happen. It's like the guy was low carb before. He was already low carb, high fat before this, and we switched over and now things are improving overall. This is like, I have another guy I'm working with, a late onset type 1 diabetes, same thing. He's at a circumstance where he went keto, his numbers dropped initially, and then over time, he needed more and more and more and more insulin if he had any amount of carbohydrate, because he became more and more insulin resistant. And then we brought carbohydrates in, and now he needs less insulin overall for a drastically increased amount of carbohydrate in the diet, and his A1C values have gotten better overall. So again, like, you can't get to a circumstance more extreme than a type 1 diabetic and that's insulin dependent, and a type 2 diabetic that is insulin dependent. So you have two circumstances where adjusting the diet appropriately, fixing the metabolic problems at the cellular level, and seeing that they need less insulin for more carbohydrate, and all their A1C values get into better ranges overall. It's like, show me another example. Like, show me another way to gauge this. Wow, their body comp is better and all of this type of stuff. So like, you can gauge. I think that it's a disservice to tell people that you can't get a sense of what's going on and create this unknown boogeyman that's in the closet that you don't know that's there or not. It's like, you can actually tell to some extent, even if it's somewhat indirect, what is going on metabolically. And this stuff is direct, right? Because you're seeing like insulin dosage changing with carbohydrate doses. Like, I don't know how else you can gauge. Like, I don't know how much further you're going to go.
I also imagine that a type 1 diabetic would have really strong sugar cravings and feel a lot better when they can eat as much glucose, fructose blends as possible. Is that correct? Have you guys seen that too?
For me, with the clients that I work with type 1 diabetes, the benefit of the like keto stuff is that it's easier for blood glucose control because you don't have to like dose the insulin quite as much, quite as frequently, stuff like this. But yeah, a lot of things do tend to get significantly better when the person is able to like organize the carbohydrates effectively. It's logistically more annoying because since your pancreas isn't producing the insulin, you have to kind of gauge and meter how much insulin you're going to use for a certain amount of carbohydrate. So for me, when I have that circumstance, I try it, like they feel better symptomatically, but then they have this logistical hurdle. And so what I tend to do is try to like set a specific amount of carbohydrates per meal. And then we have a standardized dosing of insulin. So we can track and see how much insulin they need per carbohydrate bolus. And then we standardize that. And then basically they just know how much they're going to have to use because the meals are relatively like they're structured. It's set. And yeah, symptoms get better. One lady I was working with, type 1, when she was keto, type 1 diabetic on insulin, lipids were like in the 800s. The only thing like total cholesterol was all the way in the 800s. And then LDL was in like the 6 to 700s. The only thing we changed was we changed her diet, covered up her micronutrients, brought carbohydrate on board, and then her lipid values dropped down into the 200s. And the doctors were like ready to do, basically she went to the doctor. The doctor said, we need to get you on statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, all the stuff. And then what we wound up doing was being like, okay, she's like, I want to try diet first. So then we started working together, and then we changed the diet, and then lipids came right down. And then insulin usage was like, we standardized it, and it was logistically easier for her, and she felt better overall. Blood values looked better overall, and things were good from there. So these are like case studies where it's like, yeah, you can gauge what's going on. And I think her circumstance was unique with the lipids and the type 1 diabetes and like being on a really high fat diet. I think like there's a culmination of multiple metabolic things going on there that was leading to that, which is why just organizing the diet with carbohydrates got things under control. And then, yeah, once the logistics are managed, I do tend to see the clients that I work with type 1 diabetes feel better with carbohydrate on board.
And I love that it honors that intuition again, instead of being swallowed by the fear from videos like this. The body is wisely communicating what it might be needed in order to correct some abnormalities or metabolic derangement. So I'm glad they've got you, Mike, and you, Jay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa.
Interestingly, in type 1, people I've worked with type 1 diabetes, I haven't necessarily seen, I know you were saying maybe there would be more cravings, especially for sugar, but there's so much external manipulation of the blood sugar. So you can have a scenario where someone's just mostly relying on keto and it's mostly stable, but because you don't have as much insulin necessarily pushing the glucose down, you don't necessarily have those same cravings that you may otherwise. But again, it totally depends on how someone's managing that. But even in people on higher carb diets who are working on getting their blood sugar down and their insulin utilization down, people with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, I haven't seen necessarily like extreme hunger or cravings for carbs any more, I should say, than anyone else who's maybe having some level of difficulty with metabolizing them, which comes back to everything we're talking about here. And of course, at that point, one of the biggest factors is the amount of energy we're producing and that regulating our appetite. But
I think the lows, if they're having a lot of lows, that's the big thing that's one of the big problems with the carbs is overshooting the insulin and getting lows post meal. It also, again, depends on regimen, right? Because if they have a long acting across the day and then there's short acting with meals, that's sometimes where I see people, if they start getting carbs, they start getting insulin sensitive, they start getting some lows sometimes unless it's adjusted appropriately. That's where the logistical stuff is the most difficult with type 1 because you don't have your pancreas automatically doing it now.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot more nuance and experimentation that has to happen with regulating the insulin to the new level of carbs. And again, that's kind of what you were saying, where it's a lot easier to manage on low carb, but there's a huge cost to that, which obviously we talk about all the time.
Right.
But I think it was such a good point, just to come back to it real briefly, which is that you mentioned, Mike, which is that if the glycation, that we're being taught to fear here from Ken Berry is happening, it's not like secretly happening in the background, right? You're not like super healthy and everything's improving, but secretly there's this glycation from glucose or fructose happening. These processes are generally dependent on the state of oxidative stress that you're experiencing, which goes hand in hand with general health. And so all of the things that help to clear out and basically work as antioxidants against the glycation end products are going to be elevated when you're healthier. And so you're not going to, you're going to be clearing them out better, as well as producing them less because you're actually metabolizing the fuel that's coming through. So it's all a really integrated system. It's not this totally separate, independent, problematic pathway you need to hyper focus on. It's just an aspect of health that you'll see anytime there's improved health, you're going to see less of this. And anytime there's worse health, you're going to see more. It can come from all sorts of different substrates, but it's not like secretly lurking and waiting to get you while you're getting healthier.
So many boogeymen. Are you guys ready to shift to the Q&A portion?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So Donovan was chatting with Grok, and he was wondering about ATP versus ROS production per calorie for fat versus sugar metabolism. And he says, Grok's answer is the opposite of what you guys are saying on your podcasts. This is very concerning for me right now after following you guys for almost a year now. I'm not sure what to believe. Even the energy output of saturated fats, ATP production, is way higher than what you claim. I'm all for understanding stress, but part of the reasons you give for the stress are partly related to reduced efficiency of energy and drastically increased ROS of fat metabolism. Help me out here. I understand that the body needs glucose, and this can create stress in creating glucose, but if this information is true, then what am I to believe? If I am misunderstanding you or misunderstanding the below information, then I apologize for my emotional outburst. So, Donovan, thank you for your question, by the way. I think this will be helpful for a lot of people. Grok responded first by going over ATP per molecule from glucose being about 30 to 32. That's an estimate. And then per calorie would be about 0.042. And what was interesting is that they mentioned how, in terms of ROS output, moderate per calorie in the glucose-driven state, and it can spike with excess glucose. When we compare that to fat, or Grok's response, ATP per molecule is about 106 to 108. Per calorie would be similar to glucose, 0.046, 0.047. And they also mentioned slightly lower per ATP in terms of ROS output due to FADH2 reliance, which I know you guys will break down, and how it can rise under mitochondrial stress. So per molecule, glucose yields 30 to 32 ATP through oxidative phosphorylation relying heavily on NADH. They argue this pathway, when functioning well, keeps ROS in check because the electron transport chain runs smoothly, with electrons efficiently funneled to ATP production rather than leaking to form superoxide. Fats, like palmitate, yield far more ATP per molecule, about 106 to 108 ATP, but the process, beta oxidation, leans on a 1-to-1 NADH-FADH2 ratio. FADH2 feeds into complex 2, bypassing complex 1, a major ROS producer, which they suggest could mean less ROS per unit of substrate oxidized. On a per calorie basis, though, fats still edge out slightly, and it's comparing 0.046 to 0.047 ATP per calorie versus 0.042 to 0.044 ATP per calorie of glucose, as Grok calculated. So, no, you're not off base. They do say sugars outperform fats in ATP yield and ROS production, especially per unit of metabolic effort. If I've misread their take, it'd be on underemphasizing fats' potential ROS advantage via complex 2, something studies hint at, but they downplay. Okay, let's start from the top. Mike, do you want to start off here?
Yeah, so I think to frame this in general, I think this is one of the fundamental problems with AI. And I don't think this is about Donovan at all. I think this is specifically about AI being a problem. Now, here's the major problems with AI that I see that are exemplified by this. One, prompting the AI is like an art to ask it the question so that it understands the output that you want it to give you. So that's the first thing, because some of the way that the AI is phrasing this is potentially related to the prompt. And even when I've interacted with the AI, I will ask it certain things, and then if I don't prompt it this very specific way that I need it to give me the output, it gives me really weird responses and answers. So that's the first thing. I think, that's actually a big thing. Now, the one that's even more important than this is that the AIs get stuff wrong all the time. But the thing is that they get very specific things, very detailed things wrong. And like overarching pictures of some things are all right. And this creates a sense of like, oh, the AI is giving me this truthful, this correct answer, this appropriate answer. But it's not appropriate, but it's hard to parse out whether the answer is correct or appropriate or not, unless you really specifically know the information. So, and I've gone into conversations with ChatGPT, with Grok, with multiple different AIs, and I run into this problem all the time. And it's, some of it is hallucination. Like I've definitely got hallucinated responses that were the foundational tenets were just objectively wrong, objectively wrong. But the thing is like, unless you actually knew the specific thing you were asking about before you asked the question, you won't know that it's wrong. It's like I was having conversations back and forth with AI about very specific chemical pathways, like organic chemistry. And I was trying to understand things. So I was reading a paper and then having the conversation with the AI, and the AI was telling me things that were incorrect, at least based on what the paper was saying. And the only reason I could know the difference because I was actually reading the paper to understand what was going on. And this is a case here where the AI is making blatantly incorrect claims. Like the things it's saying are false, but you won't be able to tell. It sounds good. It sounds right. It seems like it makes sense. They're talking about all the same things. It's using the terminology. So I think that's a huge problem with the AI stuff, is that it needs to be vetted, and the user, if they're asking a question about something that they don't know, they can't critically vet the AI, which, for Donovan, he's like, look, I'm not really sure what's going on here. So let me ask you guys, because you guys seem like you know what you're talking about with this. And I think that's actually like a decent solution to try to either go in the research or read something or talk to somebody who you feel like they know the information. For me, that's what I'm doing, right? I'm going to go find a paper to vet what this thing is talking about. So I think for Donovan, I think it's like a good approach to try to vet the AI statements instead of blatantly accepting them. And then I think for everybody in general, it's important to understand this about the AI, that like it could be 90% correct and it could be 10% incorrect, or it could be 98% correct and 2% incorrect, but you don't know where the 2% incorrect is. And that's a huge problem, because sometimes that 2% incorrect is really important and can like really fundamentally change how you think about things. So here, but one of the major problems with what the AI is discussing, and there's blatant things around the amount of ATP per molecule. When you start to look at metabolism, the size of the molecule, the number of carbons versus glucose and palmitate is significantly different. And then when you look at how they're metabolized in the mitochondria, that accounts in large part for the changes in ATP. So it's like you're not comparing apples to apples when you're looking at the metabolism of the glucose versus the fats, because of the differences in carbons and how they're metabolized. So like comparing them on a basis here of, how much ATP per molecule isn't necessarily super helpful to try to gauge which is a better fuel source. And ChatGPT frames it this way and oh, well, fats produce more ATP. And this is something you see in the low carb sphere. It's like, well, that doesn't really matter that much. It's like saying that glucose or that fructose is more, it creates more glycation than glucose. It's like that doesn't really matter that much when you understand things in the appropriate context. Now, the next problem here, the next huge problem that we get into is that ChatGPT is saying that fats create less ROS per ATP than glucose because they produce more FADH2, and which runs through complex 2, and complex 1, which is where NADH runs through, and carbs produce more than NADH. That's the site where more ROS is produced. They're saying, well, since more ROS is produced at complex 1, and more NADH is produced by carbs, then if you're oxidizing carbs, you get more ROS. And since fats use more FADH, which gets processed by complex 2, when you get less ROS, that's actually completely incorrect. And that's not how it works at all. It's like blatantly false. And I actually have a video on this on my science channel talking about reverse electron transport. And the problem of reverse electron transport is driven by the fats producing more FADH2 in ratio to NADH, driving more electrons through complex 2. And then that is what pushes the ROS production at complex 1. So this is actually an 180-degree opposite statement of what is actually going on in the mitochondria and physiologically. And again, like, unless you actually go and read the like really nuanced paper on what's going on between carb metabolism and fat metabolism, and then the ratios of NADH and FADH2 and how that affects things at the electron transport chain, you can't vet this statement. So it seems correct. It sounds about right. You know, Jay and I maybe said some similar sounding things on the podcast, but ChatGPT it's like blatantly false here. So this is I think the biggest thing. This is the most foundational piece. Obviously, the ATP per unit molecule I mentioned too, but the fats specifically drive increased ROS at complex 1 by producing more FADH and hogging coenzyme Q at complex 2. So this is why I think it gets wrong. Not to mention, ChatGPT alludes to this, but carbs produce more CO2, and it's not that the CO2 necessarily mops up that ROS more. It's more that the more CO2 that's produced allows for an increased unloading of oxygen at the tissues to serve as the electron carrier at the electron transport chain, which also can speed up the rates of reaction overall because it creates a feed forward reaction inside the mitochondria. So there's it gives hints to the CO2, doesn't get to the core points that we've talked about, kind of like gives a separate semi-straw man argument or an incomplete argument from what we've discussed. And it completely gets the fat versus carb utilization inside the mitochondria and the electron transport chain wrong. And again, like, I think it's like, this is the problem with the AIs. Even when I was going through some of the organic chemistry, I was having a conversation with the AI about, like, I had to correct it multiple times. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, I didn't get that right. Once you prompt it, but I would have only known to correct it because I was reading papers on the side to try to make sure what it was saying was like 100% correct, so I can understand the particular mechanisms I was looking at. So I think this is that's the, I guess, debunking Grok, and then also one of the big things, if anybody's using AI, to keep an eye out for, that you need to really vet the answers, because if there's like a fundamental thing like this that's wrong, it completely changes how you are actually going to understand what your interventions are down the line with your diet, and that could be a huge problem. That could be right, because this if you take Grok's word, it's like, oh, I'm gonna eat a high fat diet, low carb diet, because that's gonna create less ROS of the mitochondria. And it's like, it's actually, you're doing the opposite of what you're shooting to do, and that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I've seen similarly, even using ChatGPT trying to find certain studies, and it will completely make them up and even give me a PMID, and then I'll go search it, and it's not real. So, I mean, I've even fallen into the trap myself, but Mike, I love that you've emphasized doing a little bit more research and using it like a tool, and maybe having some fun with it and asking questions that are feeling curious for you, but taking the time to maybe fill in the gaps and question everything it says. Jay, when you look at this summary and its response, any other holes you want to hone in on and talk about?
Yeah. But just to start, I mean, I've had that same experience, right? Where it'll make up studies, it'll make up quotes from studies. You can give it studies, like provide it, and it'll still provide quotes that aren't actually in it. So if you're going to use it, as we've been saying, use it really carefully, verify single thing it tells you, at least for things like this that I would say like matter, if you're trying to ask something that's a little bit less controversial or a little bit less interpretation based, because nutritional research inherently is, and there's way more of it than I think in a lot of other sciences, although maybe not so much. I think, as I'm saying it, there's a lot of interpretation in any scientific field. But if you're asking very simple questions, I think it could be okay. But you want to definitely verify where it's getting things from. Ask it for its sources. Verify those sources. Actually read them and confirm that they're saying what it's saying that they are, because so often it's not. And again, as you learn that, you can try to prompt it differently, but also you start to rely on it differently. Like I would not recommend, like you can, if you're starting from scratch somewhere, which someone like this probably doesn't have, I don't think Donovan has a deep understanding of biochemistry, and he's just like, hey, these guys are saying this, I don't really get it, I want some help understanding it, so he's looking for help. And this can maybe give you a general lay of the land but I would even start before this. I think what I would say is use it to help understand what happens at the electron transport chain. Use it to understand what happens at the different complexes. Use it to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about the FADH2 to NADH ratio. And then come to the conclusion yourself. Use it to help understand the principles and still verify what it's saying, as opposed to asking it for the actual answer to the question, which it's so often wrong because it doesn't do a good job of actually thinking. It doesn't actually think. So, but we can. So we still have to do that part. It can't replace our thinking. We don't want it to. So on that front, I would say we definitely want to be really careful outsourcing anything to AI, but especially anything that requires thought, and as opposed to just action. Like maybe it can search for something for you instead of you. But if it actually requires thought, I wouldn't recommend outsourcing to it. And for that matter, I wouldn't recommend outsourcing your health to us either. There's a reason why we cite the studies that we're talking about, and we try to go through the mechanisms to try to help people understand, instead of coming up with ridiculous, oversimplified analogies to get someone to believe us because it sounds good. It's really worth, if you're going to care about this, I would, to the extent that you can, to the extent that you want to, take a look at the actual mechanisms that we're talking about, take a look at the studies, and you can use AI to help with the concepts you don't understand. But for a case like this, especially, we cite a ton of studies in every time that we're talking about this, explaining the exact thing we're talking about. We didn't just make it up out of thin air. So take a look at those and use AI to help you with the concepts that you don't understand, but again, use it carefully. But it's a good example. We get this a lot in our comments too. Someone who put something we said, or take the whole transcript of our video and throw it into AI and say, why are they wrong? And then it comes out with like a paragraph of just often things that are blatantly incorrect and just things that are not even representing what we're saying. And then they'll just throw it in the comment as if that disproves us or something. But yeah, you have to be really careful. It will fully make things up, make up studies, misquote things. So I think there's a place for using it as a tool, but we have to recognize the limitations of that tool, and it won't tell you its limitations. So just something to be really aware of. Another thing I want to mention real quick when it comes to AI, and then I want to talk about some of the actual physiology real quick, is that it will also tailor answers based on previous conversations and the kinds of things it thinks that you want to hear, or the kinds of perspectives it thinks you have. So if you constantly direct it in a certain direction, or you ask your questions in a leading way, for future questions that are even not asked that way, it'll be going based on its memory of your previous conversations. So if you are a low-carb person, you're always asking things in the vein of low-carb things being beneficial, and everything is oriented in that direction, and then you give it something that sounds objective, it will still give you what you want to hear in many cases, even if you tell it not to sometimes. So just a lot to be careful about with these language models, and not to allow them to displace our actual thoughts, our actual thinking. But yeah, as far as the actual physiology here, Mike touched on the most important points, which I think is, the crucial thing is it's not even understanding what we're saying. And so we're not talking about ATP per molecule. It's really totally irrelevant. In the same way that, for example, we know in a gram of fat, there's 9 calories, and in a gram of carbs, there's 4 calories. So you could say, oh, well, fat has more energy. And it's like, yeah, if you equate it by grams, that's doing the same thing by molecules. Like, that's not actually relevant. But in any case, like, you're not comparing apples to apples. It's like saying there's more sugar in a mango than an apple. So an apple is healthier because it has less sugar. But it's like you're not equating for portions. You're not equating for the amount of sugar in there. That would be the thing to do, as opposed to doing it the other way around. Obviously, that's with the assumption that you're thinking sugar is unhealthy, which obviously we don't. But so ATP per molecule is not at all what we're referring to. Obviously, fat produces much more ATP per molecule. It's much larger, has more carbons due to the nature of how it's oxidized. That's not really important to us here. ATP per calorie isn't either. And it's actually, again, Grok is not really touching on this nuance, but it's kind of reverse engineering. Like, calories are meant to be equated, in terms of ATP as well, even though they aren't perfectly. So the values that they're getting at are really just a rounding error. Like, it's not exact that every gram of fat equals exactly 9 calories and every gram of carbohydrate equals exactly 4 calories. There's actually slight differences. It's not exactly 4.000 and 9.000. So that's really all you're seeing there. Again, that's kind of more of equating potential energy in both, but that's still not the point. What we're saying is that if you have the same potential energy of both, the same potential amount of ATP, the same calories of each, the same amount of usable substrate coming in, that fat is going to be disadvantageous than carbohydrates. And the way I would phrase it is more so looking at the reactive oxygen species to ATP ratio, the ROS to ATP ratio. That's really the best way of looking at it, because then we're equating it based on the amount of ATP produced, not based on the molecule or the calorie. And when looking at that, again, if you were to give this same Grok conversation that question, it would say fat is better. But that's because of the misunderstanding that it's having that Mike pointed out, which is that, yes, complex 1 is more of a driver of ROS production, but that's going to happen in the context of dropping off more electrons at complex 2 due to ubiquinone competition and due to reverse electron transport. So even like, if someone else were to look at it and say, well, complex 1 drives more ROS, so dropping off more electrons at complex 1 must be creating more ROS, that makes sense. But the reality is it's not the case. And the research that we point to, the studies that we've cited in the articles and podcasts where we've discussed this, lay that out very clearly. So I think it would be worth looking at those. But that's really where the central misunderstanding comes from, other than the fact that, it's looking at molecules and calories instead of like a relative to ATP production. But the other thing to mention too is the rate of ATP production is then dependent on ROS to ATP ratios, because when we're producing more ROS per ATP, we have inherent brakes on the system. The oxidative stress slows down certain enzymes in the Krebs cycle. It'll drive uncoupling. It'll do a number of things that will actually slow down respiration and reduce ATP production. So not only are we talking about this ratio just in terms of getting less oxidative stress, but it also leads to a faster rate of ATP production over time, because you don't have this constant brake driven by ROS. So those are really the things we want to look at. And those are driven and largely determined in this case by the FADH2 to NADH ratio. It's just Grok got that part backwards in terms of the application. So yeah, I mean, that's, I think, really the central point here. And I would just highly encourage anybody who's interested in this enough, and especially getting emotionally wrapped up in it, right? Getting really concerned. Am I doing the wrong thing? Are Jay and Mike wrong? Have I been doing the whole wrong thing this entire time? Like, I get the fear there, but in that case, like, let's use that to read some of the research and learn about the concepts we don't understand, and maybe review some of the podcasts where we've talked about it, where we go through it with the diagrams, because I think, yeah, that's a great opportunity to turn that into learning and critical thinking, as opposed to outsourcing that to the AI, which as we've talked about it, I think is a really treacherous path.
The one thing I want to mention here too is I think it is difficult for people to read some of the research. I think that is something that people do struggle with. So I have had people say, it's like, you and Jay all the time, you guys like, yeah, just read the research. It's like, I tried to read the research and I didn't really know what 100% they were saying. So I do think it's important, even if you don't go with the papers, maybe try to look in some textbooks or something like this. And then on top of that, I mean, part of what I see part of our role is to like explain some of these concepts appropriately, so that people, and like try to make it, more approachable for people, a little like less of the lingo, to try to break it down as much as we can in the videos so people can kind of understand things while still citing the research. Because I think you have other people, like Dr. Ken Berry, who's trying to make it approachable to people, but you have to fundamentally be correct when you use your analogy first. You can't start just making an analogy to make it approachable, and then the like principles behind the analogy, like the entire perspective, is incorrect. So the first thing, and that's, people say, oh, you read too much research, you cite too much research. It's like, that is a way for us to be like, hey, this is what they're saying in the papers directly. So you don't have to just take my word for it or take Jay's word for it. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to explain in the best of our ability what this means, so that like in normal English, right? Because the papers aren't written in normal English. That's part of the barrier, is like you have all these terms like NADH and FADH2. It's like, what does that mean? It's like alphabet soup. I don't know. So the goal is to try to like make it as best as possible a little bit more approachable. Another thing I want to say here that can be important is like, if you are getting, like, if you're doing this stuff, you're feeling better, things are moving better in another direction is all together, you can also gauge by your experience and some of your outcomes as well. Now you have to be careful here, right? Because people go on keto and like the first, like after you get through your keto flu, it's like, oh, I feel way better. And this is the best diet ever. But it's like, at the same time, you want to use some of your experience to adjust and rely on some of your own internal guidance system with what you're doing and try to figure out what's going to work best for you while trying to understand some of the mechanisms to the best of your ability, trying to understand the perspective as much as possible. I'd say you want to like combine both, like the real world experience on top of the theories. So you want to say, is I'm going to do this and I want to see this outcome. And then you test it out. That's just the whole perceive, think, act model, right? Is I have a perception that something's going on. I've been on keto for a year now. I can't sleep. My gut is like, I'm all sensitive to all these different types of foods and I feel stressed out and I'm getting energy crashes and whatever else. I lost the weight initially, so that was great, but something needs to change. So like if I have a bit of carbohydrate, do I feel better? Do some of my numbers get better over time? These types of things, you want to set that up and engage from there when you're doing this type of stuff so that you have the real world experience and you have some of the understanding of the mechanisms and theories like as you're going through that process. And then once you see your outcome, then you can adjust and go from there. Because I think as much as I understand a lot of this research and read the research and like I'm having conversations with the AI to figure out really in-depth mechanisms about certain things as well. And then going back and forth with the papers to parse that together. At the end of the day, a lot of things that I learned and a lot of the things that prompted me to go ask those questions, to go read those papers, was I experienced something in my own personal life. It was like, hey, I need to change this. I need to fix this. What's the next step? What's the best thing to do? What am I actually looking for? Defining that set of goals and then figuring out how I'm going to get there and testing it out and then just adjusting. So it's this constant iterative process of trying to figure out what's going to work best for your system and then trying to understand why. And I think, when you put it into that context, I think that is maybe, at least when I'm working with people, I find that that's a little bit more approachable. And we start to say like, what can we do to like move the needle in this particular direction? And also the why becomes important. The why and the how are important because like, how are we getting this needle to move? How are we getting that A1C to drop? That's very important. Instead of like, oh, it just dropped. It's like, how and why is it happening? And is it happening? So we want to have all three together instead of, oh yeah, it dropped, I'm good to go. So these are, I think, really important things. And the other thing I want to mention here too is that just because I don't think there's actually any paradoxes with this stuff. So just because you got better results or like you lost weight or you got better hemoglobin A1C when you dropped carbs initially, doesn't mean then that adding carbs were necessarily the problem, or if you add carbs in, that things are going to get worse. So there's like, that's why we try to put the mechanisms and the pictures together and the context together here. That stuff is important. So you can understand, again, why did this particular thing happen? I think these components are really important. So, and I think even when Jay and I are like going and looking at somebody else's work, we usually start from the perspective of, okay, let's just understand this guy or this lady's this point of view. Like, let's just get into their shoes, understand what their point of view is. And then like, maybe like I go into it, I'm like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about here. And this person knows something more than what I do. So I get in, I try to fully understand the perspective that they're coming from. And then I work back from there instead of going in with this person is just completely wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. And I'm just going to like invalidate it. And that's how over time, for me, it's been every time we go through and we talk about some dynamic, like I learn something every time. Every single time we talk about somebody's perspective, like even with the vitamin A stuff or the oxalate stuff, like I think for both you and I, Jay, like we get so deep into the weeds of trying to understand what's going on that we learn so much along the way. And it actually gives us a better picture as we go forward and helps us to work out some of the kinks in some of our own perspectives and improve them as we go. And I think for everybody, I'd say see things as this iterative, ongoing, organically unfolding process. This was something that was central to Dr. Pete's work. And this was something that like this how I thought about things and how I viewed things was a massive like shift for me, like a life-changing shift for me. Instead of saying like, I need to have my line drawn in the sand and I always believe this going forward or else I'm a hypocrite and I don't know what I'm talking about. It was more like, I'm probably know like what I know in some of these areas, I probably know pretty well right now. And there's things that I need to continue to learn. And as I learn more, you see, you have to learn more and more and more and more. So it just keeps going. Like it's like an endless thing. So I would approach this stuff like that as well. And I think that will eliminate some of the fear and some of the pressure of like, I need to absolutely know this thing right now. And like, I need the exact answer. So I'm going to go to Grok and Grok's going to give me this answer. And now I'm more confused. It's like, it's going to take time and understanding and working with the stuff to get it down pat. I think for me, that was really important in my process. And I think that may be helpful for other people. Listening with clients, that's how I try to approach things as well. It's like, let's just set this up and see how things adjust, and we'll tweak and go from there. Because the other thing is a lot of people are like, the response to things are very individualized, right? Like Teresa, we talked even on the other podcast, you do well with starches and I do well with sugars. And then Jay's kind of in the middle between both. And it's like, we're all in this like bioenergetic pro-metabolic perspective, but how we're skinning the cat is different based on our different contexts. And I think those are also important things to consider as well, and integrate into the process, that there's going to be individualization with this, which inherently requires you to go through the process yourself and work out some of these components and use your real-time experience as you move forward.
I love that you're emphasizing staying open and not necessarily needing to know or thinking that you've come to this conclusion, or almost like you've pinned down this truth or this absolute, because I'm sure all three of us are continuing to evolve and refine and even question things that we thought were true. And I think back to carnivore days where there was absolutely a period of time where I thought that was the answer. It just felt like this is the ideal optimal diet. And I kind of brainwashed myself in a way, and to look back and see that as a beautiful learning opportunity, that there's so much to be said about staying curious and not letting fear dictate the way we take in information. And I'm not saying Donovan did that at all. In fact, it seems like he was using his curiosity to see if he could vet what you two were saying on a different podcast. So maybe continuing to be curious, ask the questions outside of ChatGPT or whatever source that is. And yes, Mike, I love the emphasis on experimenting, gathering data, and recalibrating as new information reveals itself, as the body maybe presents things that you wouldn't really see in a paper or in a study, but you've got that firsthand data point that something is amiss, or your body's trying to nudge you in a specific direction. I think we can overcomplicate things sometimes if we tune into real-time symptoms and feedback. There's so much to be said. And yes, I know sometimes that might feel complicated to try to parse out what is leading to what, but if we can calm down and stay curious, let fear be over in that corner, and use the curiosity as we investigate and play around, it can be kind of a fun process as things start to improve.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think I'm really glad you guys brought that up. And I think, in terms of people struggling with reading the studies and I don't think everybody needs to dig into the research. Sometimes I think it might be a matter of like rewatching a podcast or taking a concept from a podcast and typing it into YouTube in a really basic sense and watching an animation about it. But the point being that the curiosity and trying to understand and trying to actually learn and critically think about it is such a better path forward. It's not immediately gratifying. It's not just here is your answer. It takes a lot of effort and energy, and sometimes it can be really frustrating along the way. Mike and I both have, I know, experienced this independently when we're trying to understand a topic and we'll get frustrated. But sometimes when we're trying to collaborate on a topic, it's frustrating. Like there's frustration there because there's things you don't understand and you're trying to uncover. It's a process of discovery, and it's not simple and straightforward. But when you come out the other side, there's amazing gratification on one hand, and you feel like you've really accomplished something. You feel like you've really uncovered something. It's a process that I don't think we were necessarily passionate about before, but it developed over time, like a passion for the learning itself, I would say, or I mean, at least learning and digging into the research and everything. I mean, that's something that I wasn't expecting, and especially in those low carb days where, at least for me, it was much more of a passive process. It was listening to this podcast, listening to the types of things, the style of things that Ken Berry was saying, the people who go on the podcast and tell stories for an hour about biology or about their life, and then try to apply that, things like that. I mean, that isn't actually learning. At the time I thought I was learning, but it's not actually learning. And the process of learning can be a lot more frustrating. It's a lot slower. It's not a passive process, and it's not immediately gratifying, but I think that is the way to actually move forward and attain better health. And also, I think when we apply this to every aspect of our lives, it allows us to really progress and move forward. And again, with the caveat being that that's going to be to a different extent for everybody, and that's okay. Just go to the extent that you can and try to build on it. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be as passionate about nutrition research as we are and dig into it for, to the depths that we do. And that's, as Mike was saying, why we do the podcast. And, it's to try to simplify it and skip through some of that mess so that, it's a little bit shortcutted for the people listening and watching.
I think now is a good time to wrap up this episode. Do you two feel like you've gotten a good conversation in today?
Yes.
All right.
Definitely.
Mike, where can people find you?
They can find me here on the Bioenergetic View as well as on Energy Balance. And they can also find me at my website, mikefave.com, and my YouTube channel, Mike Fave. What about you, Jay?
Feel free to check out anything else on the Jay Feldman Wellness YouTube channel. We got Bioenergetic View podcast, Energy Balance podcast, and some other videos on there. And then also my website is jayfeldmanwellness.com. Tons of free resources there for people to check out.
Awesome. And you can find me at Living Roots Wellness on Instagram or livingrootswellness.com, or my tapping community at tappingwitht.com, and also on the App Store. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for watching. Feel free to drop any questions below. We love to see them, and we will see you on the next episode.